We are broadcasting to the world. You've all got coffee. I have a Bloody Mary. You too could have a Bloody Mary if you are well behaved during this first session. We have a quick break and there will be Bloody Marys or Bloody Mary-esque drinks made by Little Red Door in Paris, or recipe, technically, by Little Red Door in Paris, served from the Whisky Barrel Cocktail Bar. If you're good, and the questions are of a sufficiently high standard. I'm going to put that down there because I don't want to slur my speech anymore. So welcome, guys. I thought that was amazing yesterday. Great tour. Thank you to the Stauning team for taking us around. And also, what an inspiring chat that was from Tommy as well. So little light bulbs popping up above people's heads all the way through that. So we're going to go straight into our first session here. First session is about resources. So we're going to be looking at wood, we're going to be looking at barley and other cereals, and we're going to be looking at peat as well. And also with contributions from your good selves, we'll widen that discussion out. We've got three amazing speakers for you, talking about science behind things, talking about initiatives that are taking place, and a more holistic view of resources and how to use them and how to use them wisely in a sustainable fashion. Our first speaker is Dr. Magali Picard from Demptos Cooperage Research. So Magali's a PhD. She studied wine science, then she joined Demptos, specializing in spirit aroma analysis. And now she is spearheading studies into interactions between wood and spirits in maturation. There's a lot of innovation in here. I'm really excited about this presentation. Magali, over to you. A round of applause.
So, hello everybody. So first of all, I would like to thank the hosts of this last edition of the World Whisky Forum, the Stauning Distillery, but also all the organizing committee, Jan, Dave, Ingvar, and Zoe, for giving me the opportunity to present how the cooper and the researcher work together to transform the oak in the barrel making process and in a sustainable context. So the first part of my presentation is dedicated to the Demptos commitment to the respect of the environment and the respect of the wood as a valuable resource. So the Demptos Cooperage was founded in 1825 in the south of France, in the Bordeaux region. And it built its expertise on the barrel-making traditions, passed on from generation to generation with the proximity of the winemakers within the Bordeaux area. And it based its barrel-making traditions on several kind of values and following exacting standards that have guided it since its foundations, such as the selection of oak wood, the impact of the oak species, the impact of the toasting recipe, and the kind of the assembly of the stave to obtain the most suitable aging product. And since almost 200 years now, both tradition and innovation have been combined in order to perform our ancient skills, but also developed dedicated and new kind of oak barrels to meet expectations of winemakers and distillers all over the world. So Demptos, but also the TFF group, the Tonnellerie François Frères group from which it belongs, have been developed an environmental policy based on three main fundamentals. The first one is the preservation of the forest by promoting the use of food label in terms of sustainable management. So everybody knows that the protection of oak forest is one of the main priority issues in the environmental context. And since we have a limited access to oak wood as cooper, we have to pay more attention about the oak as a tree, but also we have to ensure the respect of biodiversity and respect for people who work in the forest. So this is the reason why our wood supply is entirely made from suppliers and producers attached to the wood quality, but also concerned about the maintenance and the renewal of the massifs. And this is the reason why we are turned towards certifications and labels for purchasing our wood. And more precisely, the PEFC label, the Protection for Endorsement of Forestry Commitment, which is one of the world's largest forest certification system. The second fundamental of the environmental policy concerns the preservation of the environment at its site by limiting the environmental impacts. So at the scale of the Demtos site production, we developed several actions to protect and to improve our engagement in the sustainable context. The first one is limit the use of water. So, for example, the wood maturation is performed in open air, in natural conditions and without watering. We don't use any exogenous products. We don't use any pesticides or chemical treatments, neither on the wood park nor in the rest of the operation. We also have signed a green electricity contract with our energy suppliers in the beginning of the year. And finally, we try to improve the transformation of the wood by increasing the coefficient of the transformation, and we aim to a destination to 100% of the wood. The last principle concerns the promotion of any product, installation or innovation that will help to limit its impact on the environment. So we have several sites of Demtos all over the world, and most of the operations have been deployed in these sites in order to limit the emission of gas linked to the transport of final products. Finally, Demtos is also facing to new challenges related to the global warming, and it's more particularly the case in the wine field because wines produced from, for example, dry and warm regions present higher content of alcohol. And from these new challenges, we have to adapt our product. And this is the reason why we propose new kind of recipe according to the expectations of the producer, which are also integrated in our last offer, especially dedicated to distillers, the Design My Barrel program. And we also, and I speak about that in a few minutes, but we also create a dedicated cask for these rich alcohol wines called OH15. So we also integrated in all the process of the barrel making a circular economy. So as I said previously, the eco-design related to the fact that all the products that we made are built in order to respect the oak wood, but also in order to limit their impact on the environment. All the barrels, since barrels are used for first application, for example, for wine application, they could be purchased for another use for another consumer. All the casks that we made are repairable and repaired by us. All the material, the product that we used for the barrel making process are recoverable and recyclable, and we estimate that 95% of the waste we generate is recycled. And finally, when barrels are used several times and at the end of life of the barrel, it is pushing towards new kind of use, such as a decoration, for example. So the then I would like to present you briefly the DEMTOS Research Center, and more precisely its role and its missions regarding to the impact of the oak wood in the whiskey maturation. So DEMTOS Research Center, was created in 1991 in the collaboration with the University of Ethnology in Bordeaux, and became DEMTOS Research Center in 2009. It takes a strong expertise in the intrinsic properties of the oak wood. I mean the impact of the oak species, the impact of the seasoning and the toasting process on the quality of the oak wood and on its molecular and sensory properties. Moreover, thanks to several kind of experiments that we developed in the Bordeaux vineyards, we are considered today as a pioneer in the knowledge about the gas exchange occurred within the barrels between the outside and the inside, and more precisely, how the oxygen transfer improve the quality of wine or spirit. And our scientific knowledge developed in the wine was recently developed to the spirit maturation process. And finally, thanks to our collaboration with the university, we have an access to a large spectrum of technological facilities which help us to get a more understanding and a more knowledge about the molecular properties of the wood and the spirits. So, for example, for the aromatic characterization, we have access to gas chromatography coupled to mass spectrometry, olfactometry, or moreover pyrolysis, which is a system which can mimic what happens during the toasting process of the barrel making, of the heating step of the barrel making, and what happens at the molecular level. We can observe that at a lab scale. We have also access to high-resolution mass spectrometry, nuclear magnetic resonance, in order to get a better knowledge about the molecular structure of polymers, of wood polymers, involved in the tasting perception of spirits. So our strategy in the DEMTOS Research Center is quite simple. Understanding what happens during the real conditions, ever on the barrel making process, but also during the spirit maturation. So we try to understand what kind of parameters are involved in the identity and the quality of the spirits, how the wood and the spirit interact to develop a specific spirit aging bouquet and overall complexity, and what kind of physico-chemical reactions occur over time during the maturation. And once we understand what happens, we can propose you the most suitable aging solution. From the copper point of view, you can develop a specific toasting or oak selection recipe. But also from a scientific point of view, we can develop the specific scientific collaboration with distilleries in order to monitoring the aging conditions and guide and give you some advices to develop excellence and differentiation of your spirit product. So the last part of my presentation is dedicated to the presentation of two kind of technological barrels that we developed with a scientific approach. And the first one is the presentation of the essential barrel. So this barrel was initially born from an observation that we have from producers that they wanted to preserve the initial typicality of their product, their wine or their spirits. And so they ask us to preserve the freshness character of their liquid over time. And this is the reason why our challenge was to identify specific oak wood presenting a high potential of floral and fruity aromas. Carotenoids are macromolecular compounds present in the large range of food, such as, for example, carrot, and they are responsible for color nuances, such as yellow, orange, or red tones. But we observe that mainly lutein and beta-carotene are also present in oak wood, and they are synthesized by the leaves, but also within the living cells of the sapwood to protect the oak tree to the oxygen attack. And interestingly, we quantify this compound, the carotenoids, in different kinds of oak woods, categorized according to their perceptive visual aspects. And we observe that higher the concentration of carotenoids, higher the red nuances on the oak wood. But however, during the barrel making process, carotenoids are degraded because the oak wood is submitted to intensive conditions during the seasoning and the toasting process. So this is the reason why we decided to study at lab scales what happened during the barrel making process. And we firstly study the impact of the light and the oxidation process during the natural seasoning. And we observe that the concentration of carotenoids in the first experiments, when oak sample is submitted to a normal daylight and at room temperature in a nitrogen medium in order to avoid any oxygen impacts, we observe that the concentration of carotenoids decreased rapidly in the first 30 minutes of the experimentation, meaning that the light have an impact on the degradation of these compounds. The second experiment that we performed highlighted that oxygen, when the oak sample are in contact with a copper solution, which acts as an oxidative agent, carotenoids also are degraded in the first 1 hour, 30 minutes approximately, and the concentration was divided by 10. And finally, we mimic the impact of the temperature on the degradation of carotenoids by studying 3 kinds of temperature. And we observe that higher the temperature, faster the degradation of a carotenoid, with an instantaneous degradation of carotenoids at 70 degrees. And it's particularly important because during the barrel making process, the temperature reach very high level, mainly 200 degrees or more than 200 degrees. So we can consider that the degradation of carotenoid during the barrel making process is very fast. But I think you wondered why the carotenoids degradation is so interesting. And it's because these carotenoids are degraded and more precisely transformed into new kind of aroma compounds called no-rhizoprenoids. And these compounds are particularly interesting since they contribute to specific floral nuances, such as violet for beta-ionon, raspberry for alpha-ionon, but also rose for beta-damascenon and damascene. And interestingly, we observed that these compounds are present at significant higher concentrations in oak wood containing higher content of carotenoids. I mean, for red oak wood present higher concentration of no-rhizoprenoids than brown oak wood, and more precisely when a medium toast is applied. So this is the reason why the essential barrel is entirely made from red oak wood, present higher potential of carotenoids, and which are degraded during the barrel making process into no-rhizoprenoids. And more precisely, during the spirit maturations, the no-rhizoprenoid initially formed in the oak are easily transferred to the spirits, interact with other no-rhizoprenoids present in the whiskey, and you can enhance the perception of the floral and fruitiness by molecular and perceptive interactions. And finally, the last barrel that I would like to present to you today, and in relation with the sustainability context, is the OH15. So grapes issued from dry and warm regions with a minimal irrigation present a very slow phenolic maturity. And wine issued from this grape are characterized by higher alcohol content, lower acidity, but also heavier perception of heavier aromas, such as more spicy, smoky notes, but also ripe fruits, which are characteristic to an oxidative process. So our challenge in this context was to develop a specific cask to get a more balanced wines. And we just focus on a cask with a low spicy and smoky impact, but also presenting specific antioxidant properties to reduce and limit the oxygen impact for these wines. From a scientific point of view, lignin are macromolecular compounds of oak wood and represent about 25% of the polymer profiling. Lignin is a hydrophobic and thermoplastic polymer, improving the impermeability of the wood and also allows the stave bonding. But most importantly, lignin is also an important aromatic precursor. And more precisely, during the toasting process, lignin are degraded into several kinds of aroma compounds, and more precisely into volatile phenols responsible to spicy, smoky, and, for example, cloves nuances. So in our context, since we want to limit the impact of the spicy and smoky nuances, we try to limit the formation of these compounds during the barrel making process. So two options to limit the formation of these volatile compounds. The first one is to limit the content of lignin in the oak wood. The earthwood is the only part of the trunk used in cooperage, since it presents higher ability and quality for the cask production. The earthwood is composed of a succession of summer and spring wood layers. And these two wood layers presenting significant differences, since spring woods present bigger vessels, higher tyrolysis, and thus higher concentration of lignins. But otherwise, in summer wood layers, you have small vessels, more fibers, and thus a less content of lignins. So our challenge was to identify specific oak wood presenting higher proportion of summer wood layer. Another criteria very important in the cooperage is the notion of grain. The grain refers to the size and the regularity of the annual grow rings. And the size of grain is directly linked to the proportion of summer wood layers related to the tree's growth rate. So basically, when the trees grows fastly, we obtain a large summer wood layer linked to a large or coarse grain. But on the contrary, when the growth of the tree is slow, you have a thin summer wood layer linked to a fine or small grain. So, since we wanted to get oak wood with a low content of lignin and with higher proportion of summer wood layer, the oak wood presented coarse grain or large grain is representing the most suitable oak wood for build the OH15 barrel. And the experiments that we performed on wines aged in different kind of barrels, either in fine grain barrel or coarse grain barrels, revealed that whatever the toasting intensity applied on the oak wood, wines aged in barrels presenting coarse grain have lower concentration of volatile phenols and thus lower perception of smoky and spicy nuances. The second option that we have is to study the structural conformation of the lignin. Lignin is composed of several monomer units linked to chemical linkages. And we have two kinds of linkage in lignin. The first one is beta O4 linkage. So I'm sorry, it's very scientific. and they represent about 90 to 95% of lignin leakage. And this structure is very sensitive to the thermodegradation. So you are able to form volatile phenols from this lignin structure. But on the other case, the other kind of linkage, beta-beta, is more complex and thus more stable to the thermodegradation. So our challenge was to identify specific oak wood presenting higher proportion of beta-beta linkage in order to avoid a too fast thermodegradation of the lignin into volatile phenols. And by several kind of analyses performed in the laboratory, we have a screening of the lignin found in the oak wood, and we observe that when you have a smaller amount of beta-O4 linkage, lower than 95%, and when you apply this for coarse grain, when a medium toast plus is applied, you produce the lowest concentration of volatile phenols in your wines. So this is the reason why the OH15 was made from a specific oak selections, coarse grain with low proportion of beta-O4 linkage in the lignin structure, and with the medium toast plus is applied to limit the spicy and the smoky flavors. So in conclusion, the oak wood, which is the main raw material of the cooper, is considered by us as a prestigious and a noble variable resource. And the oak wood that we use in the barrel making process as entirely issued from forest managed in the sustainable context and managed by the National Forestry Office in France. And the selection of oak wood follow a specific selection, identical year after year, and we have an entire control of the timber supply chain. And once the staves arrived at the Demtos site production, we applied a specific quality traceability in order to guarantee the origin and the quality of oak wood. And we are now able to be certified at 100% on the overall process of the barrel making process, from the toast selection to the final product. And from the researcher point of view, we try to optimize the use of wood in the barrel making process and in the different steps of the barrel making process, but also we optimize the use of oak wood in the spirit recipe in order to, for example, improving the maturation speed of your spirits. So thank you for your attention.
Magli, thank you so much for that. That's pretty remarkable science going on there, guys, isn't it? I can feel the questions bubbling up, but you're going to have to wait until, because you were late. Sorry, William, because you were late yesterday. After all three speakers have given their presentations, we will then have a discussion. So store those wood questions away. But we're going to continue really with a kind of bridging presentation now. I hadn't told you about that, Greg, had I? Talking about oak, but also talking about barley at some point as well. So our next speaker is Greg Glass. Greg started in the whiskey industry as a tour guide, like a few people here. He then worked at a whiskey maker at Compass Box, and we have his successor in the audience somewhere, James. And then in 2016, he joined White & Mackay to take over, or be trained up, and then take over from Richard Patterson, the great Richard Patterson, who was the master blender there for about 150 years. And as you can see, Greg has not followed in Richard's sartorial elegance. But what he has been working at is this fantastic project, the Scottish Oak Project, which is a kind of holistic, long-term vision for wood management and working with coopers, working with foresters and sawmills across Scotland. And that's going to be a focus on his presentation here. So, Greg, without any more ado, please come up. Greg Glass.
Sartorial elegance, you said?
Yeah, I said lack of.
Lack
yeah.
of, okay. Thanks very much. Listen, thank you very much. Hopefully I'm a better whiskey maker than I am a presenter, but what would be great is to share with you something that's relatively new in our industry, in the Scotch whiskey industry, and maybe get a little bit of feedback from all of you guys later with some of the liquids that I've brought along as well. It'll be great to get your feedback from around the world. Not sure if that's, oh, there we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of a project which is really a passion project for me. That was something I'd thought about almost 15 years ago. We talk about the 3 ingredients that we use in Scotland: water, barley, yeast. I'd argue there's maybe a 4th, oak, within there. We talk about the importance of the whole maturation process. When I was invited to talk about sort of finite resources, how I would classify finite resources are materials. Time is within that. Flavour potential as well. So within the Scotch whisky industry, we've got perimeters that are around what type of wood that we can use, but within oak, we can also diversify into local sourcing as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the Scottish Oak programme that we've developed, but also really talk about the partnership of people and the importance of people, skills. Sustainability for me is about that long-term view, and at the heart and core of that is people, and that's not disconnected from our environment, our other resources. Really, it's people-focused, whether it's this generation, the next generations, or future generations as well. So it'd be great, again, to get your guys' feedback on some of the liquids a little bit later. So some of the partners that we have within the Scottish Oak programme, for me, what was important in developing is as a single whiskey maker, and even as a single company, we can only achieve so much without having partnerships across the board, inside our industry and outside it. Also with you guys, who I classify as my colleagues, whether you're in Scotland or not, is how we can maybe utilise our local resources much better. So I always thought, from a flavour point of view, we talk a lot about the water, the barley, and increasingly about yeast and fermentation times, all these things. But one of the key components in terms of flavour impact, we tend not to talk, or increasingly now we are, but in terms of that local sourcing element. So the Scottish Oak programme really started many years ago in thinking about whether each individual single malt distillery could look at sourcing as local as possible. And one of the disconnects there was the wood sourcing element to it. So really it comes down to challenges. Scottish Oak, we don't really have managed forests, and certainly after the First World War, we didn't. A lot of the land management went away, a lot of the people who were managing the forests. So obviously one of the biggest problems is we've got these sprouting trees, lots of branch points, lots of imperfections in the wood, and that management policy, which you guys in France have managed for since Napoleonic times and before that point, so really ahead of the game. But really it's about sort of these challenges, such as we don't have managed forests, the trees, it's a finite resource, it's very rare. Now, what I found out in talking to other partners like sawmills were that we've got fantastic quality oak and the foresters, but we're actually sending a lot of it elsewhere for processing. So I was always told that there wasn't enough good quality Scottish oak locally, but in actual fact it was more about the fact that they were able to achieve a higher price by selling it abroad, or they were sitting on that stock. So that got me thinking, well, how come we don't just try and keep it here, and try and keep that finite resource, that precious material here, to add value at all different levels. So that partnership, so partnerships with Ashes, the Association of Scottish Hardwood Sawmillers, they really represent the majority of the independent sawmills in Scotland. And a lot of the sawmills in Scotland were closing down. Since the closure of the mines in the 80s, pit props were a big part of their business. So as that went away, a lot of these small sawmills were closing down. So it was about engaging a part of the chain to help develop this process. So ashes are very important. Speyside Coopers are a key partner for us as well. So without having coopers to make the casks, there's no point in developing a program for it. So I think you mentioned about the holistic viewpoints of what I might talk about, and really, I think most of us in the room here are end-to-end whiskey makers or makers of any type, whatever department you're in. So really trying to look way back in the chain and for the future development of that. So engaging people right back to the sawmills and finding out what their challenges are as well. So again, maybe not getting the best price for their oak, having to export it, so it's not staying within our communities, but also challenges such as the types of equipment in sawmills as well that maybe are not suitable for cask construction, but how can we manipulate the different equipment that they have? Some of the equipment goes back to the 1950s and before then. Some of it's much more technological. So how can we work together in partnership to develop different techniques of milling the oak as well? So in terms of managing this precious resource of Scottish oak, was really trying to take the best learnings from around the world. What are the techniques that are being used in North America, in Europe, and other places, and looking at how we can maximize this precious resource. So working with different sawmills. So you can see here, I mean, that's quite a beautiful tree. It's maybe not all the parts of this tree are going to be suitable, but it's really about selection. And that dedication to selection and working with the right partners. So just to step back a little bit in terms of what holistically we were trying to achieve with this was looking at utilizing this precious resource, having a flavor-led approach as well, looking at how we could expand out the different potentials of flavors, adding stories. That's always going to be part of our jobs as well, that it's from the local area, but also looking at, again, taking the best practices from different places, maximizing the offcuts for oak as well, but that management. So you can see here, typically we would not be using this size of timber. It's quite small, but we can get maybe 1 or 2 sections from there and rescue some of this oak, which would be for firewood. So it's actually sort of thinking differently in terms of our specifications and working with the experts on the ground once we've got a specification of how we might want to mill the timber. So as most of you know, we're typically quarter milling the oak, but we can also select out from through and through cutting as well. So this project actually, one of the initial partnerships we had was 4 or 5 year air-dried Scottish oak, and that was from them milling through and through, and we selected out from their sections that were suitable for cask construction. So obviously one of the big variables is the drying process in Scotland. As you can imagine, it's slightly wetter than Spain, America, and France in particular. So that was one of the biggest challenges, was to then start to look at, well, how do we do a drying regime in Scotland? Either we keep it for an extended period of time, but even then, if we're lucky, we can get it down to about 20% moisture, if we're lucky. So how about if we relocate that oak in different areas where there's a higher airflow to help that drying, or do partial kiln drying in the process too? So actually looking at every different level, taking the best practice from around the world and applying it to our own local environment as well. So that's one of the big variables that we have, is obviously the drying regime. So we need to look at time as a precious resource, a finite resource also within our construction. So you can see here we're doing different milling practices, different milling techniques, and it's all made by hand. Typically, we're toasting the casks, traditional toast, but we've also experimented with charring of Scottish oak and different heat treatments on the heads of casks as well to bring out different characters. So from a sort of, if you like, a technical coopering perspective, we've had to adapt based on our environment and the properties of our raw materials to try and maximize the oak yield itself. So as most of you know, your European oak is approximately half the yield as American oak if you just round it down a little bit, and then Scottish oak is below that. But what we're trying to do is work with our partners so that nothing is wasted, so that we can try and get the cost of this to be not quite the same as French oak, for example, brand new French oak, but closer to that. But it's about the value. So the value of Scottish oak and the management, I think, is also in the creative accounting that we can use. So instead of considering putting it into your cost of goods from the first or second use, these Scottish oak casks that we're making, we're going to track this right the way through the system. So we know, yes, it's say a 200-year-old tree that's come from. I know that these are going to be suitable for 200 years of use if we manage that oak properly. So it's not just about that responsible sourcing of this finite resource. It's also about that management that we're doing throughout the process. So each of the casks that certainly I've developed are all laser etched. So, and there'll be no paint on them whatsoever. I had a conversation with someone else about paint last night, is that these are going to be traceable throughout all the years. And then we're looking at also practices of rejuvenation as well. So all the Scottish oaks so far that I've been developing are shaved by hand so that we can get it as precise as possible, and then refiring, retoasting at that level. Looking at, finishing period, short finishing period to start off with, maybe an extended finishing period for second use into new make, and then from new make, rejuvenation after that. So when I'm talking about how do we account for the additional costs that we're looking at, so to give you guys a steer, Scottish oak barrel can be anywhere between sort of a £700, maybe £1,000. But it depends on the supplier. So the way that we're working is we work with the Ashes Group in terms of the partnerships of different sawmills, but not every sawmill is the same. So a bigger sawmill, we have a standard price that we'll pay per cubic meter, but some of the more remote sawmills, we will pay more because their costs are more. It's labor intensive. They maybe don't have as many efficiencies. So it's actually working in partnership with everyone. We have an industry standard price, but from there we'll then divert through so that we can make it a reality for Scottish oak to be something in the future. So it's not just about creating our casks now, it's also about thinking about the future. So what we've applied, and with the help of Speyside Cooperage as well, is that for any Scottish oak cask that's built, made, bought in Scotland, there's going to be planting and replanting that's attached to it. So by its very nature, by responsibly sourcing Scottish oak, there'll be a management plan for that forest area, and there will be replanting that's occurring. But that's not enough for us. We need to look at beyond that. So we're looking at planting, not just replanting as well. So we've invested heavily. I've had some interesting conversations with accountants and people like that, how to justify a 200-year project. But we're looking at that replanting aspect, but also planting for the future. So to cite an example, up here at Fettercairn, we've actually got around about 13,000 oak trees that we've planted. And this is actually a test site where we've got Quercus robur and Quercus petrea in the same area. So we're actually going to look at the assessment of the different growth rates and the ground conditions that we have in that area. But that is a sort of statement that we really wanted to make for the future, is we'll invest in this, and it's not just about planting a few trees. It's also about the management of those. So we're actually working with our local estate that Vetcairn Distillery is actually based on, to look at the future management of that. So we'll go back in every year for the next 5-10 years, and then go through 25 to 30 year cycles in terms of then pruning the trees and then taking out those for the health of the forest around it. So we're actually also looking at then how do you utilize younger oaks. So the 30, 50 or 100-year oaks, like you saw earlier, a picture of a smaller oak section, and how we do different milling techniques to be able to maximize that. So we're doing full planting. We're doing replanting of areas where there's been trees that come out. So this is Cairn, just outside of Glasgow, and that's where we've helped and helped fund and part fund some of the planting that we're doing there. We're also then looking at the holistic benefit of planting. So it's great you plant trees, but most of that happens whereabout? In the countryside, where there are quite a lot of trees often. So we're actually also looking at urban planting. So we partnered with Tiny Forests to do a planting in Glasgow, in actual fact in the centre of Glasgow, and that's looking at then that holistic benefit. And if you like, there's an element of that sustainability that's there, is actually to bring the story to people where there's more, more communication, more population as well, and then also connecting to wilding and rewilding initiatives as well. So we're trying to look at this holistically. Is we're planting dedicated forests that the potential is that the oak can be utilised for the Scotch whisky industry or other industries also. Hopefully, if you guys, when you have the samples this evening, you might want to buy some Scottish oak off us, possibly. But hopefully what... Yeah? Yeah, well, yeah, maybe. Well, not quite yet. Not quite yet. So that's really what we're looking at. So at the moment, we're rather than oak saplings, which tend to be higher, oak trees that we've planted throughout our process. Now that's talking a little bit about the Scottish oak element, but we can then connect the dots. So for the likes of Vetcairn, our single malt distillery in Aberdeenshire, is we can then connect that local raw material to other things like local barley, looking at creating yeasts that are based on the local environment. And so we're then starting to get that holistic element of everything coming within 5 miles, 10 miles of the distillery, but not just for the sake of that, but also for the flavour potential. So one of the things I get asked a lot as well, what makes it then different from sourcing from elsewhere? Well, if you can control all the different stages of the process, you can manipulate the flavour. It's almost like when Magdalene, you were talking about sort of degradation of characteristics and flavours. Imagine you can create a cask and fill it within 24 to 48 hours from a toasting type. Think about different techniques of pressure testing. So rather than using water for pressure testing, you can use gas detection systems, or through the sort of craft and skill of the coopers is creating a tight cask where you've got that freshness. I always talk about roasting coffee. You want to let it rest for a little while, but after a certain period of time, you start to diminish the qualities and flavours that come through the process. Talking about longevity, it's also about building for the future. So we're talking about planting, replanting. We're talking about the sawmill industry, also the flavour potential that we could have as an industry as well. But also another big part of that is coopering. So there's not much point in developing this without thinking of the future of skills as a finite resource as well. So what we've developed with Speyside Cooperage is a training program within their apprenticeship scheme to train the apprentices how to build casks from scratch. So in Scotland, really, it's largely about repairing casks. So Darren Morrison, the Master Cooper, and Malcolm there, they've helped in training a lot of the apprentices who've now come on to become full coopers now, how to build casks from scratch. So that's another aspect of this, is from the generation who have now retired largely, where they were building casks. Okay, the oak might have come from the Baltics, for example, and they were then constructing it from that aspect rather than Scottish oak, is then developing those skills for the future. So when we talk about finite resources, I think it's not just about the Scottish oak, it's also about the skills, it's the mentality, it's the training, it's the educational piece as well. You know, what I love about our planting in particular, replanting, is trying to connect sort of our local communities around our distilleries about the processes, and where nature then informs through nurture how we create something. So it's not necessarily the whiskey, it's about the cask and those traditional traditional trades. And even going back to traditional trades, we're trying not to waste anything within our process. So even the bark from the trees goes into making, you know, we've partnered up with a local leather maker who's going back to traditional tanning methods to utilize that. So it's thinking about how we can then use this finite resource in a sort of in a way that helps us from a marketing point of view as well as anything else. You can pass around that. It's really, it smells lovely. It's also been tanned with tea, as well as that. But then we can think about packaging. So we had an initial chat on the bus this morning, you know, about packaging being very important. So we can then start to feed off of that. So what about the offcuts of the cask making program? What about things like old filter sheets at the bottling halls, and all of these different byproducts that we have in the process? So we can make paper out of that, possibly labels. We can connect it all back into that process. So from a sort of initial idea, oh, this is one of my favorite little saplings here. So you know, from that sort of initial idea, and again, hopefully I'm a better whiskey maker than a presenter, but probably gives you an indication of where we could possibly go if we start to sort of turn some of the challenges of finite resources or the received wisdom into something that's maybe greater than the sum of its parts, and really start to think about how we can work together collectively in getting the best aspects of our holistic ability as makers to hopefully benefit more people than just our own industry. The end. Have a look at that if you want. Pass it along.
Thank you so much, Greg. Inspiring stuff, really. I remember I went on a wonderful road trip with Greg a couple of years back, looking at sawmills, obscure sawmills with men with hardly any fingers, and him talking about establishing a gold standard for Scottish oak. But it's more than that. It's a gold standard for the idea of sustainability, not just being about, oh, it's all about us, but sustainability actually has to be this wider discussion about community and about people and about the world. So, Greg, amazing work. And we'll pick up on a lot of these points after our next speaker has spoken. So I'd love to introduce our next talker, Professor James Brosnan, who's the director of the Scotch Whisky Research Institute. He is the chair of the International Barley Hub, which is based in Dundee, which is an incredibly, again, inspirational organisation. And he's also the director of Baritone, which makes him sound like an opera singer, but that's as an industry and academic collaboration to train up barley experts specifically about sustainability. He has many years of research experience since 1994, I believe, James. So if you want to know about barley, this is the man. Also, if you want to know about beetroot, this is the man. But he's going to be talking about barley today. James, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I'd have to have a few drinks to talk about beetroot anymore. That's definitely in my past. Just like to start by thanking Dave and Jan for the invitation to come and speak, and also to our hosts here at the distillery for making us feel so welcome, and for the great tour yesterday. So thank you for that. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking to you about barley sustainability and trying to look at it because it matters on a very local level, but it also matters on a global level, and trying to cover these things. I was kind of inspired by the one of the aims of the World Whisky Forum, the thing to unite the world of whisky, and it's this kind of idea of unity that I would like to explore as well. These are difficult times. The point was made yesterday. Things are very challenging. And when things get challenging, from a biologist's point of view, you look to evolution working. And if you're talking about evolution, you might look to Charles Darwin and to see what he had to say. And he made a point there. We know about survival of the fittest. But this point too, in the long history of humankind, and animal kind too, those who learn to collaborate and to improvise most effectively have prevailed. So taking these words of wisdom, I'd like to go on. I'm lucky enough to work for a very collaborative organisation. For those of you who don't know, the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, based just outside Edinburgh, owned by the Scotch whisky industry, our 16 member companies, and this is where our funding comes from. It's run as a research club across the whole membership. So we have some small companies, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society being our smallest member, right the way through to our largest member, Diageo, but all coming together to engage in this program of pre-competitive research. And this enables us, in our history of nearly 50 years, to take the long view about things, a long view about the research that's necessary. So in terms of sustainability, much of our research is focused on this at the moment, really with doing the science to find out how we can make the distilling process more sustainable, but also if you're introducing changes for sustainability reasons, how do you then manage and modulate any flavor changes that might occur, making sure they are what the distillers want. So in our laboratories we do this. You can see the guy with the stills, Barry Harrison, who leads our raw materials and processing research. Barry's an online viewer today, so hi Barry. And also much of the technical information I'll come to later on was generated by Barry and his team. Right, so start off with the well-known thing. When we talk about sustainability, what are we meaning? And obviously you'll be familiar with the three ideas of it. The economic, we need to actually be here. We're not going to make whiskey if we're not actually making some money in order to carry on making whiskey. There's also the social element. Our whiskey making sits in communities. It impacts our supply chain. It impacts people and the wider society in which we're there. But of course, there's the environmental sustainability, and that's where a lot of the focus quite rightly is, because that's linked to a rather wide and global picture in and around climate change. Now this idea, this is the challenge facing us at the moment. How do we, again, modulate the effects of climate change through preventing increased climate change, mitigating climate change that then will be here and on the way, but also how do we then adapt to the climate change we end up with? And there are various models of this depending on that rate of climate change. 1.5 degrees, things are green. Climate scientist to me was saying in relation to this, the other scenario, game over. I talked to some really cheery people, but anyway, but this is why it matters, okay? It's there. So why should whiskey be sustainable? And even though we can have our part to play, the whiskey or distilling industry is not going to save the world. Okay, that isn't really what we're going to do. But what we do have to do is to meet our consumers or our investors' expectations. We also need to meet increasingly the government and other regulatory requirements as well. But the conversations I've had in the last 24 hours and across the membership that I represent is People have a genuine desire whilst making whiskey to be doing the right thing. But doing the right thing is no longer about sort of, oh, well, I don't do any harm. You have to be demonstrating that you are doing some good, which is a very positive thing. And if we do this, then yes, we are hopefully making our part in saving the world, but we are also justifying using resources in order to make whiskey going forward. Because the justification for making whiskey in a challenging environment is that thing. Whiskey brings a little bit of sunlight into people's lives across our consumer group. We need a bit of sunlight, I suggest. You could argue we might need a bit less literal sunlight, but anyway, yes. But anyway, the thing. But that's important. Now, the industry in Scotland, we working collaboratively on sustainability in terms of policy. The Scotch Whisky Association have got an environmental strategy covering energy use, water use, land use, and circular economy. All the details of that are on their website, and that's what the SWA membership is signed up to delivering. More collaboration. But how do we do that? I'm just focusing on greenhouse gas reduction. What are we doing as distillers? Okay, so what are we doing? How do we actually do this? And it's a concept here of really, are we players or are we cheerleaders? And there's many ideas within the supply chain where you can argue. I know there are some exceptions in this room of people who actually are also doing the farming and taking the barley and things, but looking at it in the whole sense, we've got a complicated supply chain full of experts also working to sustainability. So how do we encourage them? How are we there visible, cheering on the sidelines to actually make things happen? This is really important. Cheerleading is not a passive activity. That's spectating. And I hope there's no spectators on sustainability in this room in that. When it comes to distilleries, that's obviously we are the players. We have to innovate. We have to do what we need to do. And then in circular economy, that wider picture of doing that, we're both players and cheerleaders. We're cheerleaders because we ought to be encouraging the innovations about how to better use co-products in more sustainable, more innovative ways. But we're also, as well, in terms of energy, we're now becoming energy generators. We're now sort of becoming, looking at harnessing other sources of our co-products and what they could be used for within the distillery in circular economy or put back onto fields to grow the next lot of barley. So, but if we're playing or cheerleading, it's still all teamwork and needs to be addressed as such. Now, greenhouse gas reduction. If you can't control what you can't measure. So it's really important that you actually know where your measurements are coming from. I guess this afternoon there might be some question of that, so I won't say any more. But we also need to kind of balance reducing emissions, whether or not there are Scope 1 emissions, Scope 2 or Scope 3 emissions, also with this other wider climate-related impacts, such as on biodiversity. It's no point in having a low carbon footprint if you can't also be demonstrating things in and around the biodiversity and other challenges that we're making. And distillers also need to rethink what they consider efficient. In terms of cereals, litres of alcohol per tonne has been the mantra for many, many times. Now, that's not a bad thing. We're here to make alcohol. But should we be thinking more litres of alcohol per a unit of ground, per hectare, to show that we're actually using or getting that resource more efficiently? Now to turn to barley. Now, barley is a really important thing. Of course, it's a foundation of whiskey. I sort of accept the fact there are other cereals as well. I work a lot on wheat and triticale and other things like that as well. It's the #1 crop in Scotland, #2 in the UK. The economic impact of barley across the UK and then the EU as well is fantastic in terms of the value added it gives in brewing and distilling. It's #4 globally, and it's like the Olympic Games. Wheat, rice, maize gets most government funding for research, gets most private funding for research. Barley comes in at #4, hence the cartoon. But it is the most versatile of these major crop groups. You can grow it on the regions of the Sahara and halfway up the Andes. There are 350,000 odd different barley varieties in existence because of that. Okay, so versatile. It's also a core food source. In many countries, people eat barley because that's what they have to eat, or is a big supply of carbohydrate. And we should also see our whiskey making in the context of barley is just not for whiskey making. It has other acute importance in other markets, but it also faces major challenges. And one of these is, yes, the challenge of climate change. And that's kind of like a big thing and to look at. It's better if you just look at it in little pieces to think what that might mean, as the next slide illustrates, with work that we work with the James Hutton Institute, looking at impacts on growing barley in Scotland and the UK. And this is just one side of this, measuring. What we're doing here is measuring plant heat stress. And they're over 2 years. One is 1976. This is real data. 1976, in UK terms, Bjorn Borg wins his first Wimbledon. A nod to my Swedish friends in the audience. But it was the hottest summer. It was the golden summer of my childhood, age 10, with this. That's model data next to it. You can see there, that it's gone from dark green to lighter green and things. That is about 41 years in the future, what the modeling, what the science is telling us plant heat stress will look like in the UK. And you might be thinking, well, Scotland doesn't look too bad. 90% of Scotch whisky barley comes from Scotland, that thing. But no, if you look more detailed, that is going from dark green to a very light green. Further south, there's more extreme things going on. And Dave asked the question, are we seeing this in terms of evolution, or does something radical have to happen? Radical has to happen. Sitting still now and just thinking little bits of incremental doing things won't necessarily quite fit in. So that's one challenge. What's the other challenge? Well, in order to make things from a biology point of view, to increase resilience, genetic diversity is a great thing because it gives you other options. And there's plenty of genetic diversity in barley in the world. But in the elite populations, you tend to find that that is definitely more limited. There's good reasons for this. There's commercial breeding, and you breed the best to the best and hope for the best, as I said, in the context of horse racing. Now, this is a slide courtesy of my friend Bill Thomas, who formerly of the James Hutton Institute, looking at called the Circle of Barley, looking at all the recommended varieties that have been on the UK recommended list from pre-1980 through, I think, to 2018. There's a huge amount of genetic variability there. But we see, actually, of the varieties that we're currently using, in spring barley terms, it's more around this area. So there's an awful lot of other genetic diversity, but we're honing in. And the strategy of honing in has been really successful in terms of production terms, both for agriculture and for brewing and distilling in the UK. We tend to have what I would call waves of barley. One barley variety is tendered, whether or not it's been Chariot, Optic, Concerto, and now Laureate, tends to come forward and takes up a significant part of the market share. It's delivering for farmers, it's delivering for maltsters, it's delivering for distillers. It is successful, but it's also narrow, and it also puts your crop out there with there. And it's likely that the following wave will be made up of, because of the excellence of these barley varieties, of the sons and daughters of Laureate and very closely related varieties. And this is the danger in that, is it resilient enough? So we need to address that. When we're looking at distilling barley, it's a complicated thing. You know, we have other things it does, obviously imparting flavour, but we also put other things there. It's got to meet various regulation things in what comes through the distillery, and we want it to be doing all kinds of interesting biochemical stuff in order to deliver our whiskey. This complexity is a mixture of both its genetics, what it brings to the party, for example, if it's a non-GN producer, but also the environment, how it interacts, and how genetics and environment interactions happen is a really crucial piece of understanding the science of barley for distilling. Right. So we're getting back to the problems that barley has. Now, global barley research, there's fantastic research going along in many centres, but it's quite fragmented. Some of it's been highly disrupted by war. There was a great barley research centre in Syria that really got compromised. Luckily, it's being built up again that looks at growing barley in arid regions called Akada. So there's lots of pressures on barley research. So how to ensure that long-term resilient supply of barley? So the answer was to get a coordinated approach to barley research. And now is a time of great opportunity in science. It's a brilliant time to be a scientist. So much is happening. And this is just one example. We know we've mapped the barley genome. We know about all the barley genes that are actually there. Now, what they're all doing is an interesting question. We don't understand how are they all interacting, but we've got the blueprint. The entire blueprint of that. This gives opportunity, so it's a great time to invest in barley science. And this led to the creation of the International Barley Hub a few years ago. What we're trying to do, barley will only be in 4th place, but it's going to be a strong 4th place. medals for research. And how is this being translated? Well, it's an umbrella organization for both the supply chain and academic partnership. That's a vision. But good science costs. For us to be credible in this space within Scotland or globally, we have to invest. And we have got the UK government and the Scottish government together to come in for £35 million to help build infrastructure at the James Hutton Institute. And for those of you who are into UK politics, if you can think of other examples where there's kind of a 50-50 enthusiasm for UK and Scottish government on something. So another example, barley brings people together. So that's great. We're going to get building. And, you know, if any of you know the James Hutton site, this is kind of going to be, look there, it'll have some ancillary bits, but really, you know, a leading edge science building. Fantastic. But this isn't really what the Barley Hub's about. That government investment is hugely important. The whole thing wouldn't be credible and wouldn't happen without it, but it's not just a building. It's building a barley science community, engaging the barley supply chain to work together on this. So we look at common and sector-specific priorities. So the barley supply chain is quite a complicated beast. We've got all the way from kind of plant breeding things, we've got the farmers, other processors, the industry where distilling and brewing would fit in, our consumers, government, other things happening all together. We got about 150 of these people representing the supply chain in a room and said, what do you want from barley research? And what was really great is, yes, people have got their own little interests, but the things that came out from that end, right the way through to the other end, was just 2 things. Quite simple, climate-resistant barley and low-input barley. 2 sides of the same coin in some ways, so that's what we've got to try and deliver with this project. But we have great tools to do it. And within the work at the James Hutton Institute, who work with other people all over the world for the International Barley Hub to get working, there is fantastic genetic diversity in barley. There's lots of different things that you can look at, not just for interest, but what could be there that will be useful. One of the examples can be, for example, in terms of things like harsh barley growing in harsh climates that's overcome deficiencies. This is an example of manganese deficiency in trial plots, so that you can actually look at trying to perhaps get useful genes into elite varieties. Because we don't want to throw away all the good work that's been done creating elite varieties. They're great. They work fine. They keep your distillery consistent spirit quality. They keep the distillery running well, which will mean that it's better able to deliver sort of a low carbon input as well. So we can do that, but we also, for climate resilience, we need to think global. We can't just sit in Scotland where we still get quite a lot of rain and where we actually thinking we've got to solve this all ourselves. There are people now experiencing lots of challenges in terms of growing crops. Let's learn from them, utilize what they know, utilize what we know, and share information. Now, what kind of science is needed? And we've heard this word, we'll hear it again, holistic approach. There is no silver bullet. If we just did this, everything would work. So we've got to look at short, medium, and long-term gains. It's agronomy, it's genetics, it's soil science, it's data, agrimetrics, modeling, it's sensors and robots and all kind of other things going on. But probably most of all, it is actually people. People will deliver all these things. These are the tools which they'll use, but it'll be people that will deliver them. And just to give us some illustrations of work that's already ongoing at different levels. One on the right, Barista. Barley lends itself to lots of good acronyms, but Barista is an EU-funded Horizon collaboration. It's led by Italy across things. Denmark is a member of this. The James Hutton for the UK. And this is looking at developing plant breeding tools for measuring sustainable barley. The Barley Hub is working with partners in Ethiopia to allow cross-exchange of ideas and fellowships sort of coming out. Barley is a major food crop in Ethiopia. It's keeping people alive. And I say it's a bit humbling we're making whiskey, but they also actually want to use some of it to make some products that they can then get export value on as well, because that's also important. Economics is part of sustainability. And this one here on the left is a PhD project that we're working with SRUC on barley disease resistance. This is a project not about alcohol, litres of alcohol per tonne. This is on making sure that there's going to be a good yield of barley in the next 5, 10, 20 years. With that, I'm really wanting to expand this idea of people and training, and this just to make you aware of Baritone. Baritone is a UK government-funded industry academic collaboration, and Baritone stands for Barley Industry Training Network. It involves 18 industry partners right across the supply chain that are all getting together in this to support this. Along with other academic partners. And what it's going to be doing is delivering 30 barley sustainability PhD projects starting in October 2022 over the next 7 or 8 years. And what's that going to be doing? Well, it's going to be, yes, addressing barley sustainability. That's important in different ways on 3 themes: soil health, lowering inputs, and climate resilience. But importantly, it's going to create a future generation of barley experts. By 2040, all our problems won't just have disappeared. There'll be new problems. We just keep needing to solve it. Who's going to do it? Well, I'm certainly not, at least hopefully not, be well retired by then. But we need to, and also this was to support the International Barley Hub ethos of collaboration, not just within academia, but across the supply chain with industry working together. And these are just, these are 4 of the projects that are about to start and with their sponsors are. So we're looking at the genetics of soil, basically, in one. We're looking at the genetics of barley metabolites in another. We're looking at advanced sensing technologies in another. And then another one, we're looking at circular economy coming from the distillery to help grow barley in the future, all being sponsored by companies as part of their own sustainability commitment, large or small companies, brilliant, working together. There is a danger with sustainability for whiskey makers. There is a danger with trying to do the right thing, is if we keep finding the right solutions. The right solutions with that. So if we all run to environmental sustainability, do we actually decrease flavour diversity? And you cannot have a whiskey sustainability strategy if you do not incorporate flavour diversity within that, whether or not it's creating new flavours or whether or not it's sustaining or keeping the flavours of your established products. And this is true, and I know I'm kind of not even speaking so much to the converted as speaking to people who have done so much to introduce diversity to whiskey making. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. I know it's an interesting area, barley variety, and these were some experiments that we did a little while, looking at a wide variation of barley grown in Scotland. So we've got kind of from Scots beer right the way through to Chevalier, which is sort of a signature barley through the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Procter, whose parent was Danish. I just add, so taking some great barley genetics from Denmark over to Scotland. Procter was a hugely important barley variety. Golden Promise, Triumph, and then slightly more modern ones, Concerto, RGT Planet, and Laureate, more closely related. So genetically diverse, we process them into new make spirit in our lab under highly controlled conditions, and they were from 2 trial sites at the James Hutton Institute. So they experienced 2 different growing environments with extensive chemical and sensory analysis. So what did we find with this genetic diversity under these conditions? There were interesting analytical differences within the spirits that we saw. Beer was the most different. It had the highest nitrogen as well. Golden Promise had some additional interesting elements to it. The modern varieties mapped most closely together in terms of what they were producing in the scheme of things. And Chevalier was consistently low on all the different kind of sort of normal range of certain kind of flavor and other congeners that we found. And that was interesting. Well, Chevalier was a fantastic variety in terms of developing the industry from, say, the 1830s, almost for 100 years. So lots of great whiskey being made there. But a lot of things were low. It's not the fact that modern barley varieties have just lost flavor as such. It's different. There's difference coming through. But what were the flavor differences like this? Well, in our new make spirit, there weren't huge flavor differences. Now, I've had a couple of interesting conversations on barley variety last night and invited criticism on this point if people wanted to. But the point is with that is maybe we shouldn't be too surprised that under such tightly controlled conditions we can get spirits which are not radically different from each other. And the lesson of the Shackleton Whisky, which is a project we did with some of Greg colleagues a number of years ago, where we have perfectly preserved whiskey from over 100 years ago. And the analysis and the sensory of that showed that it was like a really good quality whiskey today, in essence of that, which is a fantastic story for tradition and for curating flavor. Now, what am I saying with this? I'm saying that barley variety just doesn't matter. No, I'm opening up possibilities. For people wanting to mine for climate resilience, they should be aware that, that they can do that and be assured they will be able to work that into their existing flavor portfolios, right? So they shouldn't be saying we don't want to be using genetic diversity as a tool for climate resilience, because you will be able to make it work from a flavor point of view. That's an important result. If you want to create barley variety and using that to create flavor diversity, I think these results, these are under, and I put them in brackets, under these conditions, that you look at what the analytical results were saying, and then you see where within the process you can actually work with your variety, genetics, working with environment to actually create something else that you want. So I'm kind of a bit sitting on the fence, but it's interesting, certainly. This is, for interest, is a map of new make spirit in 2016 across many of the Scotch whisky distilleries. It's a flavour, it's sort of just really to give you an idea. Within new make spirit, we are creating flavour diversity at this moment in time. We repeat these type of surveys going forward. These spirits are very different from each other at different ends, and this is assessed by the SWRI sensory panel. So there is a lot of different flavours going on with that, but we need to preserve this. Okay, so this will be essentially from a small number of barley varieties, probably a small number of yeast strains, but we can still, within the distillery, create fantastic diversity. One aspect of malted barley that's important, we'll probably talk a bit about peat from that, but obviously is peat is a source of iconic Scotch flavour, which you'll be aware of. And peat from different locations does taste different in the spirit. We can show it's analytically different, we can show the sensory differences. But peatlands are a key environment in terms of climate change and preserving biodiversity. So although distillers are only using a tiny amount of peat in comparison, we do need to make sure that the peat that we do use, we are using most efficiently again, in that. And again, this is collaboration with the malting industry, and SWI, we're doing some research. We have a fancy combustion oven that we can burn wood in as well, and do burning peat to look at that. So finally, tools to promote flavor diversity. Well, the first tool is obviously people, the people who will be assessing that. Whiskey is a sensory experience. So that's the whiskey creators, the whiskey blenders, the people in this room, your company's sensory panels making those decision-making on that, our journalists and whiskey writers promoting whiskey diversity to wider audience. And of course, our consumers all have a role to play in helping us keep whiskey diversity there on the table. But flavor research can actually give us and make sure distillers have lots of choices. And one technique that we use widely at SWRI is GC olfactometry, so putting together a machine with a human being. So you split the whiskey up into its components parts, and you have someone at the other end to actually assess those parts. And we do this a lot. We invite blenders in as well to have a go with some of their products. So you're splitting whiskey down. Whiskey is one of the most complex food materials that's been used using this technique. And a fairly standard whiskey with a good assessor, this is the type of individual flavor notes that you can see. None of them, interestingly, smell particularly like whiskey, which showing it all adds in. So there's no shortage of flavor complexity at the moment to work with, and I suspect tonight this is going to be well proven by your products being on show. So I have a lot of optimism in this area of flavor to be there. So just to sum up, collaboration is going to be the key to us being a sustainable future. We need to embrace that sustainability. We've got to be part of the solution and not seen as part of the problem in what we do. A holistic approach. Don't just focus on greenhouse gas. Think about sustainability with the other elements like climate resilience and also biodiversity. And not just trying to do the same things the same way. We've already heard with the two previous talks of examples of really trying to move away from that same way of thinking. And there's payback in the short term, but again, it's a long-term game, and distillers have got to be committed for that long haul. But we're all better united. And I think the final point I'll be making is this one, some Danish proverbial wisdom. Things have been a bit rubbish for us in the last few years. There are a lot of challenges that people wanting to make whiskey will be facing, and barley just being one of them. But this, I think, speaks very powerfully. We must sow even after a bad harvest. So just hang in there and keep on going. So with that, and apologies if I lost all track of time.
James. Thank you very much indeed, James. Thank you. There we go. Thank you to all our speakers. I think we might have a little break, a comfort break, as I think they call it in the US, and also Bloody Mary break if anybody wants it. If we could reconvene in probably there's a lot of you, not many toilets. 10 minutes time, that'd be great, and we'll get on with our discussion and continue this idea of radical thought. Thank you.